Okay, we're good.
All right. Welcome to CHI's Beyond Belief. We are now in week 6, the final week, focusing on creation as a theme in Paul Ricoeur's Religion, Atheism, and Faith. We'll do a little review and then jump into this week's lesson. So last week we looked at repetition as it functions in Ricoeur's argument, and we discussed how it has 2 different implications in his argument. First, it functions as a form of consolation that emerges through an act of consent. Looking to recollect forward, the present into the future forces us to confront reality without protection or accusation, which again were the 2 things in the beginning, the corrupt elements of religion that he wanted to stay away from. Ricoeur cites 4 ways that this offers consolation without those corrupting elements. So first, at a biblical level, he suggests that the conclusion of the book of Job, where Job receives back twice what he lost, offers a repetition rather than a gift through the logic of retribution. Ricoeur discusses this as the, quote, fulfillment of hearkening and seeing, connecting Job's abilities to have the world gathered in the Word, the conversation he had with God, and to participate within that world that the Word offered. The second way that it offers consolation without the corruption of religion is at a philosophical level. Here, Ricoeur connects it to our participation in language and discusses how it blends logos as that which gathers and phusis as that which surpasses. A repetition, which looks to add meaning to a second installment of an event in a world that gains significance in its recurrence, consoles us as we prevail in our participation. Third, Ricoeur adds that repetition helps us to avoid resignation to the logic of vengeance that Nietzsche ultimately finds himself mired in. Consolation, viewed from this lens, becomes, quote, deliverance from vengeance. And finally, we discussed, and this is the second way, so those are the 3 ways that it offers consolation without the corrupting of religion. But overall, we discussed how repetition structures the whole of Ricoeur's argument. It's a way of understanding how religion and atheism become related to the tragic faith that Ricoeur describes. Ultimately, the faith is a repetition of what's true in both religion and atheism, but as a repetition, tragic faith adds meaning to both of the preliminary stages. So that sets the stage for this week. So tonight is the final class, as I said, and we're going to look to the function of creation as part of the act of consent at the heart of a creative faith. We begin with an examination of vengeance, and then we'll examine how dwelling, poetry, and creation help to structure the performance of a tragic faith. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. So we start on page 466 with the discussion of vengeance. Ricoeur spends a bit more time discussing this term, defining it as the will in self-opposition and therefore resentment against time. He states, quote, the fact that time passes is the catastrophe which causes the will to suffer and on which the will takes revenge by denouncing that which passes because it passes. To overcome vengeance is to overcome the negation within the affirmation. Put otherwise, Ricoeur interprets Zarathustra's anguish against time's passage in terms of its effects on the will. The yes-saying that Nietzsche promotes is limited by the resentment at its heart. The Nietzschean will is a defiant will, but because it remains defiant, it cannot overcome that which it defies. Right? Its defiance keeps it rooted and anchored against its objects of defiance. Right? It can't move. It can't go on past that. It can't move forward. Ricoeur claims that, quote, Nietzsche's work itself is infected with the spirit of vengeance to the very extent that it remains an accusation of accusation. Right? So again, here, what Nietzsche does not like is the guilt that emerges through accusation and religion, right? And so he's able to defy that, but he can't move past it. So it's just a negation of a negation. It becomes hard to affirm past that point. By continuing to perseverate on the problem of accusation, a Nietzschean will keeps it alive. Does that make sense? Okay. So Nietzsche remains stuck in the rebellion option that follows hearing word as a command rather than hearkening to language itself. And it's because, quote, Nietzsche's will to power remains both an act of acceptance and an act of vengeance that Ricoeur must find an alternative. Sheer defiance through vengeance doesn't work. I mean, it works. I mean, people can live that way. A lot of people do live that way. But ultimately, for Ricoeur, that's not the most fulfilling life. And so for a tragic faith that comes after atheism, he wants something better. So what Ricoeur does is look at dwelling, which is a Heideggerian term. It's an alternative to vengeance in a term called Gelassenheit, which, quote, marks the submission of individual language to discourse. Gelassenheit is an old German word. It's found in the writings of Meister Eckhart, who is an older German theologian, that was repopularized by Heidegger. And it describes a stance of openness to the surrounding world. It's letting oneself be open rather than closed off or projecting onto. It's that kind of openness, or that way of being centered that allows oneself to gather things, not project onto them, but open to how things affect it. So the most basic level of openness, according to Ricoeur, must occur at the level of language, of hearkening. And so Ricoeur adds, quote, consent must be joined to poetry. And that's approaching how he's defining openness. At this point in the essay, Ricoeur returns to Heidegger, particularly his work on Hölderlin, collected in the essay Poetry, Language, Thought, where Heidegger thinks through the implications of the line, quote, poetically dwells man on this earth. And so that line from Hölderlin sends Heidegger off in a whole different direction of what it means to dwell poetically, and Ricoeur's picking up on that from Heidegger's essay. So Ricoeur writes, quote, to the extent to which the poetic act is not a pure extravagance, but the beginning of the end of a wandering by the means of an act of creation, poetry makes it possible for man to dwell on earth. Right? So poetry isn't something superfluous or over the top. It's that which is the most basic act of beginning to stop wandering. Right? It's how we take root in a place. I'll return to him. This occurs when my normal relationship to language is reversed, when language speaks. Thus, man responds to language by listening to what it says to him. The terms earth and dwelling are loaded terms in Heidegger's writings. Earth, for Heidegger, is the thingly element, the material element, the substantial element, that grounds and concretizes our existence, and whose nature it is to refuse and to conceal. To dwell requires that we connect language to a place in a creative way. The easiest way to think of dwelling is in contrast. Okay, so dwelling, and especially a poetic mode of dwelling, and I'm not even sure that you can dwell without having a poetic element to it, but you can think of dwelling as contrasted with occupying. To occupy a place, you leave as little of yourself as possible there. Right? So you can occupy a waiting room, you can occupy a seat on a bus or a seat on a plane, you can occupy a lobby, but as you occupy, you put as little of yourself into that place as possible. Right? And when you see remnants of somebody else staining a place that's supposed to be occupied, it's grotesque, right? There's something really gruesome about that, where you can feel somebody else's presence in a space that's only for occupation. Right? The problem with occupation, there are a lot of places that we have that are meant to be occupied only, right? Just our whole world proliferates with places that we occupy, but it turns our body into things, right? I mean, it might as well be occupation of boxes or stacks of things, right? They're not places for anybody to flourish in a human sort of way. To live in a place is something different. You can put a little, this would be like a hotel room, right? Or if you're staying at a friend's house for a weekend or something like that. You can live in a place and you can have a little bit more of yourself there, but it's still contracted, right? You're not dwelling there. You're not going to put down your roots there in the same sort of way. It's a temporary space where you can have more of your stuff around maybe, but it's still not yours. Dwelling is the way of being that makes a place yours. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So to dwell in a place means to own its history, to know its future, and to find ourselves entangled with it in such a way that it becomes an extension of us. right? Where you know a place like the back of your hand, where you understand, where you remember what's come before that's not there now, and you can anticipate where things are going within that kind of geographical zone. That place becomes part of your own being, right? Your own flesh. Like it's part of your, you can feel it in that way. We cannot dwell merely by constructing new houses, right? I mean, all the like plots, acres of new houses that go up, those aren't dwellings yet. And it'll be a while before one can dwell there, because there's not, that sense of history is, attempting to be erased and then reconstructed in terms of strip malls. It'll take a while before those can become dwellings, as opposed to just temporary living spaces where a family can move in and move out 3 years later. There's a difference between that. We dwell not in new houses, but in language. And that's where Ricoeur really wants to put us. We're physical beings. We need physical sites and locations and places. But primarily, as humans, we dwell in language and make language and discourse the foundation of wherever we find ourselves. Right? So we start telling stories and narratives. We have certain idiosyncratic terms for where we live. We understand informal landmarks or things like that. And we recognize them the way that we recognize our own face in the mirror. That's what it is to dwell. Or to dwell poetically. Unsurprisingly, Ricoeur adds that, quote, dwelling is another name for Kierkegaard's repetition. It is the opposite of fleeing. Right? So rather than taking flight into inauthenticity, rather than taking flight in that kind of way that you would occupy, right, and never put down roots or stay at that kind of superficial way of being in a place, dwelling is the opposite of that flight. It's rootedness. It requires that we concretely present ourselves in the future of a place. That we tie our lives and stake our lives into what a place means. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I'm going to take a quick drink. And then we'll talk about poetry.
This reminds me of a certain part of Walden where he finds